Good morning. I am Janetta Candelario, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Meridian's 20th anniversary celebration and introduce you to our opening panel of the day, Deconstruction, Crafting the Tools We Need to Teach. Moderating this panel is Liz Pryor, history professor at Smith College. Thank you, Liz.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the panel. I'm Liz Pryor, Associate Professor of History at Smith, and I'm also hold a position as a Teaching Fellow of Inclusive and Equitable Pedagogies. I'm delighted to moderate this panel, Pedagogies of Destruction, Crafting the Tools We Need to Teach. Here are my esteemed panelists. Shoba Sharad Rajgopal is a professor of ethnic and gender studies at Westfield State University and the chair of the department, and holds a PhD in communications. Her research and teaching areas are in post-colonial and transnational feminist theories, Asian queer movements and media representation, South Asian cinema and globalization, religion and gender conflicts. Dr. Rajgopal has worked as a TV news correspondent based in Bombay, Mumbai, India for the Indian TV networks, and won plaudits for her news reportage. She has also done in-depth news reports for Indian TV and CNN International on political and social issues in India, focusing on the rights of women and indigenous communities. So welcome, Shoba. Lena Palacios is a former assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Her research and teaching focuses on prison abolitionism, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, queer, and trans feminisms, girls' studies, transformative justice and community accountability, media activism and media justice, health justice, as well as participatory action research. A career changer, she has left academia and is in her second semester studying nursing at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. She works as a PCT CNA at 2 Baltimore hospitals and is aiming to become an RN and eventually a nurse practitioner. Welcome, Lena. And then last but not least, we have Karsonya K. Wise Whitehead, an associate professor of communications and African American studies at Loyola University, Maryland, and the award-winning radio host of Today with Dr. K. In 2019, she received the Exceptional Merit in Media Award from the National Women's Political Caucus. The Baltimore Sun named her as one of Baltimore's 25 women to watch in 2019, and Essence magazine included her on the 2019 Woke 100 list. Whitehead is the author of 4 books and is a columnist for the Afro-American newspaper. So thank you, everybody, for coming to this panel to celebrate Meridian's 20th anniversary and your beautiful work in Meridians that's featured in The Reader. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for the intro.
You bet. I want to get everybody on the same page with us, so I thought I'd kind of introduce them to your work a little bit in case they didn't get a chance to read yet, and then we can jump into the conversation. Each of the essays thinks about teaching and learning in different spaces, places, with different audiences, and at different moments. It's exciting to me to think of Meridians as the space that provided you the opportunity to think through teaching, the intellectual process of teaching, the activist process of teaching, and teaching as as a praxis, and not just either a craft or a theoretical proposition, which I think is really unusual and exciting about all of your essays. I wanted to kind of take this opportunity to jump in and think about each of your pieces. Shoba's essay imagines the Center of Learning as a predominantly white institution, a PWI, in the Northeast, with students who are white and of Asian heritage, who necessarily spend much of their classroom time acquiring tools to help them to, quote, recognize that certain patterns of behavior are not the norm, but are, in fact, ways in which non-white populations are perceived within the dominant discourse. Students in Shoba's classes spend most of their time unlearning white supremacy and deeply embedded anti-Asian ideologies before the real lessons can even begin. Using primarily television and film, Shoba teaches that Asian women and Asian American women are mostly depicted within two reigning tropes. That of the evil dragon lady, the daughter of Fu Manchu, for which the essay is named, and as women who are victims trapped and oppressed by the men of their own cultures. Indeed, as Shoba writes, most non-Western cultures are depicted in film and TV as backward, barbaric, and patriarchal. One of the really interesting issues that arose in this piece was the idea that Asian women are also grappling with this kind of internalized anti-Asianness and understanding their own relationship to whiteness. I see this in my own classes where some of my Asian students are super radical and kind of are able to claim that social identity, while others see themselves culturally as kind of like basically maybe white adjacent, like they haven't really fully thought through what their racial identity was. And I feel like, and I mean, actually, most of my students, not just Asian students, but, and they feel disempowered to claim that racial identity. And I will ask you later, Shoba, if you can talk a little bit about how you resolve this tension in your classroom that you talk about in your essay. For Lena, the classroom is imagined very differently. Lena's students are already radicalized, already aware of their own positionality as Indigenous and or Black women in Canada and the United States, who are marginalized by societies that presume their criminality. For Lena, the pedagogical project is teaching community building, and I think teaching activists how to, quote, create multiple strategies that dismantle the carceral state and the racialized gendered violence that it mobilizes and sustains. Lena asserts a set of questions that run through the essay. How have Indigenous and what she calls race radical feminists identified and theorized the legitimized violence of the carceral state? What questions are activist scholars asking? And what insights have those critiques generated on social movements dedicated to anti-racist, feminist, anti-violence, Indigenous, decolonial, and anti-prison abolitionist praxis? After laying the groundwork that constitutes an Indigenous and race radical feminist critique in practice, Lena lays out a gorgeously rendered, and it really is, you should check it out, lesson plan designed to, in the words of Dylan Rodriguez, engender a disorientation of the teaching act. I love that phrase and I love how you use it. Asking students to imagine the unimaginable, and perhaps here's where the pedagogical work is most akin to Shoba. Lena asks students to explore their own personal relationship to the material, to unlearn their own understandings of the carceral and the feminist, and how they have been socialized within, touched, target, punished by, resistant to, and or complicit with maintaining the prison regime and privileged by it, and creating meaningful connections between this work and their own social location. Finally, there are basic but never standard pedagogical tools Lena insists upon in the classroom, open to hearing new ideas, even when you disagree, and sometimes, and something I'd like to hear more about, which is what you call shadow boxing, which is really interesting. Kay's imagined classroom is different still. Kay sees the possibilities of the classroom in creating intellectual space for Black girls and young women, a category she defines not only as hetero, cis women and girls, but it also includes non-binary, trans, and gender non-conforming folks, and anyone outside of the, quote, implied dominant circle of historical privilege, meaning those who are not part of the white, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, cisgendered, middle-class, educated, and Christian imagined norm. The classroom space itself is broadly conceived as academic K through 12 spaces, as well as undergraduate classrooms, but also the dinner table and book clubs and spaces where radical work can be engaged and shared. In the piece, K centers Meridians itself, which is so interesting, as a pedagogical tool for making Black feminist theory accessible to the intended audience, in a place where those materials are not even readily available. Moreover, Kay sees the role of archival research as critical to the restoration of Black women's and girls' stories, and ultimately encourages her students to develop a pedagogical toolbox to embrace what Kay calls, and I love this, forensic historical investigation, a strategy of which I'd love to hear more soon. What struck me about Kay's essay in particular, which was the introductory essay for a collection devoted to Black girl magic from 2016, in which Lena's essay also originally appeared, is the imperative for an intellectual project such as the one that Meridians makes available to center the experience of radical feminists and women of color. So the question really for everyone in a minute will become, how important was Meridians to this radical project, to your own thinking, to making that space possible, not just for the readers, but for the possible students across various imagined classrooms, and for you as scholars to engage questions of pedagogy that are not only theoretical and scholarly, but are also part of classroom craft. Okay, so with that, I just want to lay out the questions that I'll get to. We'll start eventually with the question about Meridians, because I think it's amazing to have the platform to do this work. But I have a few other questions too, which I couldn't help but asking when I was reading your pieces. It is impossible to read the pieces. Shoba's published in 2010, Lena and Kay in 2016, without thinking about the current political moment. Each of the essays, Shoba's published when George Bush was the scariest thing we could imagine, and Lena and Kay, who published in early 2016, none of us able to imagine the fascist reality that we've come to, right? So in the 2021 COVID Trump white supremacist George Floyd Breonna Taylor moment, how has that impacted, revised, changed, further radicalized, invigorated, disheartened, or caused you to reimagine or even double down on your pedagogy? So that's my first question. For all of you, and Lena, I think you addressed this most directly, I'm always eager to know how this actually works in the classroom, how we actually do it, right? And so I want to say, hear more, Shoba, about the tension that I mentioned earlier in your classroom. It's very different from the classroom of Lena and Kay, right, of radical indigenous, feminists and Black feminists. Do you use the same methods for different audiences that you're teaching? I'm actually asking, this is like asking for a friend. How much unlearning do students need? Do we trouble ourselves with giving them before we start our lessons? How much do we have to do that groundwork, or do we just kind of launch in to the radical work we hope to do? Lena, as you mentioned in your lesson plan, you sort of insist upon a kind of radical listening in which everyone is allowed to stumble through their thinking. You talk about calling in rather than calling out. And how do you navigate that kind of openness in a space like the ones where Shoba and I teach, in which we have white students who are deeply indoctrinated in white supremacy, all students, not just white students, right, quite frankly, right, who might not have had the opportunity to have their minds blown yet and are going to ask questions that might be infringe upon the rights or personhood of their classmates. How do you navigate that? Is it fair to our Black and Indigenous and student of color colleagues to make that space available? And how do you do it in a way that's fair to everybody in the space? Finally, I have specific questions for each of you. I know we're not going to get to them all, and I want to hear audience questions too. Lena, can you say more about shadow boxing? How do you make that space available? Shoba, how do you resolve the tension with these Asian students who you talk about, who come to class, who are from the Northeast or from middle class spaces and maybe haven't grappled in the way that you hope that they would have before they get to your classroom? And then Kay, can you say more about turning your students onto the forensic historical historical investigators? Is this archival work? Is it theoretical work? Exactly what's the how-to of that process? So I want to thank you all for allowing me to engage with your beautiful essays. I encourage everybody to read them more thoroughly because I haven't done them justice. And I want to start by thinking about the role of Meridians and a platform like it to be able to have these kinds of conversations. So I open it up if anybody would like to start.
Okay, I can start. First of all, greetings to all of you, my fellow panelists. It is such an honor to be with such wonderful scholars, and greetings to everybody from Meridians and from the NWSA, yay! And to my students, of course, my students and friends who are also here. Well, I would like to start by saying that Meridians is a highly respected space for all of us students of color who work on topics that challenge the dominant discourse. As of course, my fellow panelists, Kay and Lena, speak of a pedagogy that disrupts. I utilize the pedagogy propounded, the perspective propounded by Bell Hooks, who refers to a pedagogy that is intended to transgress. And I find it liberating, actually, to present my ideas in a space that I know is open to anti-racist feminist pedagogy, whereas in many other spaces, they may not be seen as objective. I think it's important that I mention this, Liz, because way back 20 years ago when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I still remember that when I spoke to my then doctoral thesis committee chair about the specific feminist methodology and theorization that I was planning to use, he actually made this statement. He said, "You mean that touchy-feely stuff?" I kid you not. So, yeah. So as such, I think it's wonderful that we have the space to share our ideas, our thoughts, and so on. Thank you so much. Meridians, you folks rock.
So I'll step in. I first want to just welcome everyone. I appreciate being a part of it. I also want to note that as the president of the National Women's Studies Association, we have a long relationship with Meridians, and we have been doing activities together this year, and we will continue to do so, even moving into the NWSA conference that kicks off in September. And I want to add that the award that I won, the media award, was actually for the collection I did for Meridians. That collection on Black Girl Magic was amplified and then went on to win a major award. So my essay, Rethinking Meridians, as a critical knowledge project, a pedagogical offering, and a Black feminist quilted narrative, was my attempt to think about the ways in which we take resources and which we grapple with some of the more difficult ideas that are a part of our society. How do we move them from this kind of academic ivory tower space into the K-12 environment and then out into the streets? Like what is the practical nature of Meridians beyond just kind of sitting with my coffee and delving deep into Lena's her article? What else am I called to do? And then I was making the argument and setting up, which was for Meridians, the first time that we actually did both articles and lesson plans. Like that was what was so different about this particular offering. We wanted to be able to give it to professors to think about, but also give it to K-12 teachers saying, go in your classroom and teach this essay. And that's how we grapple with it. You mentioned kind of when we came out with the piece, even though we were not under the Trumpian era, we were still within a white supremacist society, no matter who was sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the systemic racism that Black and brown folks were dealing with. It didn't matter that Barack Obama was ordering the drone attacks, right? It didn't matter that you had white and brown police officers in the street with Black Lives Matter 1.0. The idea was, how did we use the work in Meridians to confront this? How do we push the four walls of our classroom? Like when we found ourselves within the Trumpian era, very few of us, I believe, as activists, as writers, as scholars, were surprised that there was a white lash to the election of Barack Obama. And I don't think we're in a George Floyd, Breonna Taylor moment. I really think that in honoring their names and honoring their legacy, understanding that this goes back beyond George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, beyond Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and Corinne Gaines, to name a few, beyond Emmett Till and the ways in which we saw Rodney King get beaten. It goes back to the history of this country and the ways in which policing is so uniquely tied to a white supremacist state that allows state-sanctioned violence. And so becoming a forensic historical investigator means moving the other, which is what we've been othered, into the center and breaking that cycle of privilege, saying that whiteness and able-bodiedness and cisgenderedness and heterosexualityness, those are the norms and everything else is outside them. We break the cycle of privilege and we start outside of that and we move that to the center.
Yeah, what else can I say to that? I'll just be quick. I mean, there's this one quote I absolutely adore by the Black Brazilian feminist, race radical feminist, Denise Ferreira da Silva, and she writes that Black feminism performs a double refusal: the refusal to disappear and the refusal to comply. And I think it's interesting that we actually can have spaces where we can have a discussion about what that double refusal looks like, especially when we're talking about living under white settler capitalist colonialism. That's also extremely that's also a carceral state. So how do you actually end up performing work, engaging work, creating social movements that usually are premised on this refusal? This country is always about, oh, let's perform something positive. Let's perform something proactive. I love this idea of let's actually perform a refusal. Let's refuse to actually engage in the liberal state. Let's refuse to engage in the carceral state. Let's try to create something new. Let's try to create something radical. Let's try to create something that actually is countering, like a counter archive. Let's create all those counter archival moments that we can build up so we can educate ourselves and each other on how to continue. Hay's great. Hay made a great point. To continue to resist, 500 years and going of fascism. Fascism didn't just pop up. And what I love about this kind of like idea, like I was able to explore all the ideas of indigenous and race radical Black feminists and their kind of notion about the abolition of the state. So to do that in Meridians was kind of dope, because usually, again, you start talking about double refusals, you talk about, abolition. I'm actually happy to see that abolition is becoming more of a household word. It used to be in other spaces, don't get me wrong. I think we've always had that discussion, but to have it kind of come back out and actually people like now starting to debate, what would it look like? What would it mean? I love that. But I think that these are the women. And when I say women, I also am referring to two-spirited, multiple-spirited, trans folks, non-binary folks as well, who have been participating in this activist work for years. So that's all I'm going to say. I think it's a very interesting space. You can play with contradictions. You can play with really radical, non-mainstream ideas. And the fact that I was able to do a lesson plan was fun. That was not something I see in other academic journals. So I would say, Meridian, keep it up. Keep on trying to break open the spaces of what a radical pedagogy can look like, because I think we are just touching the surface. So that's it for now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I can't help but wonder, and I think all of you could really answer this, like, how do you refuse to engage as a teacher in the class? Like, how do you create a space that refuses to engage with the liberal state or refuses to engage with, this, I think, Kay, you kind of talk about it in the essay, like this white norm while you're building a classroom space. Like how I guess is my how-to question. I'd love to hear more, but I mean, really, like, if you could like break it down into small pieces, because I know as a teacher, when I go into those spaces, those are my intentions. And then I'm met with like seeing all my students as individuals, not thinking about the big umbrella, and not knowing how to navigate those awkward moments. There's disruptive moments that, social identity, racism, whatever brings into the classroom. And so I'm just wondering, how do you refuse, like, in that classroom?
I like to believe that I'm more radical, probably in my own life than I am in the classroom. Like, if I'm really being transparent, I teach at a persistently and predominantly white institution that's rooted in Jesuit Catholic ideas. I teach classrooms of predominantly white students that have come through Catholic schools, that if they've learned nothing else besides how to do all their prayers, they learn how to be good, complacent students, right? So you give them an assignment and they go do it. It doesn't mean they are deeply engaging with the work. It doesn't mean that they're asking other questions about the work. It's give me the assignment. My assignment is to read bell hooks and write an essay. I've done that. Now, whether it's radically shifted how they see themselves is something that maybe I find out later, maybe I don't. I still have to work within the confines of the environment where I try to be challenged. And I try to think that this is my stand, kind of my last stand of Custer here, is that I won't bring white authors into the classroom. I won't show clips by white people in my classroom. I won't center whiteness in my classroom. And I pay for that. I pay for that with my evaluations.
Yeah.
I pay for that in the way in which I'm centered in the university, that I am paying a price for it now, even as I'm fighting to submit a package to be full, right? Because of the ways in which race and white supremacy are so central to persistently white institutions, even when they say it's not. So the radicalness is sometimes shaped and tendered, and sometimes it is what holds me back if I want to advance my career, because my evaluations absolutely suck, right? Like, all she talks about is race. All she's talking about is white guilt. Is there nothing else? Are there no white people she can ever lift up? You pay for it. Now, I've decided that the price that I'm paying is not enough to take my soul. So I'll pay the price, but I'm also in an environment where there is a price and a cost to doing this type of work in the classroom.
Absolutely.
Well, Kay, hats off to you. That takes a lot of courage. And in fact, it takes a lot of courage to teach our courses from our specific radical perspectives at this moment in time, even at this moment in time, which may look more positive, of course, than the previous blatantly Islamophobic and xenophobic administration. But that doesn't mean that our work is over. For example, just this morning, I signed a petition regarding to call out the Asian spa shootings of last month as a hate crime. Because can you believe it? It has still not been declared a hate crime. And of course, that brings back the comments made by the sheriff, actually condoling with the perpetrator, with the assassin, saying he's just had a bad day. So I realize that this moment is as important for us to assert that black bodies and brown bodies are disposable. And to talk about the fetishization of Asian women's bodies, which is, of course, the focus of my essay. And I talk about it now, about the necessity of looking at it through the prism of both the Cold War of the past and the ramifications of the Cold War on the present, and in fact, the mounting of a new Cold War, and of course, the so-called war against terror. And in my Intro to Women in Studies classes, this is interesting. I take a book which does not look very radical outwardly, namely Malala Yousafzai's autobiography. But it is a book that brings up a lot of issues that students can really relate to and surprises them. For instance, Malala talks about the drone strikes of the Obama administration. She doesn't just talk about the warlords and the Taliban. She also talks about the Democrats and what they have done and not done. And I think that's very important. Because even right now, if you look at the current moment, when the Biden-Harris administration have declared that it is time for the United States to move out of Afghanistan, why is it that they have not said one word about the fact that no Afghan feminist organizations, no women's organizations have been brought into the conversation? If you look at the news reports, I've been watching the news reports with astonishment, seeing that no women's faces are present in those conversations. And then we are congratulating ourselves on what we've done. I think that is absolutely outrageous. And of course, we must, even as we talk about the virulently patriarchal and misogynist mindset of the Taliban, why do we not talk about who it is who brought the Taliban into existence in the first place? The United States. Why is it that we do not talk about that? I think it's very, very important to talk about that. And also the fact that it was the Reagan administration who referred to them as, to the Mujahideen as freedom fighters, but it was the next administration that continued to have secret dealings with them. So both the Republicans and the Democrats have blood on their hands. So, but how do you talk to students about it? How do you get them to understand all these issues of American foreign policy? I'm happy to tell you, actually, friends, that my students now appear to be more woke to all this than they were 10 years, 12 years ago when I first wrote about it. And to go back to your previous question, Liz, your questions are so amazing that they really bring up so many issues. So your previous question about using Meridians as a platform to think about things, about pedagogy with regard to issues that you've already been writing about, you know, or covering as a media person, as an academic, whatever. I find a good way to get students to think is by asking them simple questions like, could this have happened into another mainstream white nation? Would, if they had harbored a similar figure as Osama bin Laden, would the United States have organized drone attacks to flush out terrorists as easily in Canada as they did in Afghanistan? Why are some nations more attackable than others? Could a US politician have got away with making the same comments that he did with regard to with regard to Afghanistan? Namely, let's bomb them back, within quotes, let's bomb them back to the Stone Age. He actually said that. Would he have said that if the terrorists had been harbored in Canada? And finally, can this be connected to Angela Davis's powerful contention that Black women's bodies are rapeable bodies, and of course, brown women's bodies are disposable bodies? I add that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you.
You want to jump in, Lena? Or
yeah, sure. In terms of the question, I'm trying to remember the question. You know, I just want to say, I think it's really important for us to also remember that a lot of the work we do is actually emerging from social movement building work, not within the classroom. It literally, the social movement building work is leaking back into the classroom. And I think that we need to also, you know, tease apart that relationship and also look at our social movement building spaces and how can we actually create more spaces where there's intentional pedagogy, where there's actually more training, more development, more capacity building, but also like, let's have more of these radical conversations. They happen organically, but I like to also see more systematic work being done. Because let's give it an example. Doing this kind of prison abolitionist, carceral state abolitionist work. I mean, Ruth Gilmore has this also great quote. I also build on Dylan Rodriguez and of course Angela Davis. They've all said very similar things, but I love her quote because she says the prison is not some building over there, but a set of relationships that undermine rather than stabilize everyday lives everywhere. Such a nice kind of change. You know, to think about the carceral state is something that we need to really look at in a way that isn't just about, let's just look at this kind of institution down the street that, you know, ends up incarcerating certain people. And I think a lot of people's definition of abolition has become very rich and is also going back to a tradition that we have had that that Black Maroons and other real activist communities against slavery have had, is that it's not just about abolishing an institution, it's about abolishing a total nation, a total state that would allow the institution of slavery to begin anyway. And that's also kind of a building on other kind of thought. So how can you do this work in a classroom? Well, first of all, I think it's really important to throw away this idea, our social movement space. We are all, in terms of this quote, you know, Paula Rojas of Sister to Sister back in the day had this great question where she says, are the cops in our heads and in our hearts? Of course they are. And Miners and Jackson have another great article called Feeling Like a Failure that appeared in Radical Teacher, where they end up actually trying to do this work with students who have actually come out of prison or who have more intimate interactions with the carceral state than maybe some of our upper middle class students and these other universities have had. And they end up feeling like a failure because even doing abolitionist work with that community is tough work. Let's never assume it's easy, because when you're more intimately connected with the carceral state, that's all you know. It's hard to break out and revision something else when that kind of form of oppression is what you've been swimming in all your life. However, for white students, for other students you guys are talking about in more, affluent areas, it's an amazing question to still ask them. How have you benefited from the carceral state? How have your community? And it's interesting, what's fascinating about some of that assignment is they start looking at the formation of their community. They start looking at laws about how their suburban community was created, how it's funded versus other inner city communities. They start looking at this kind of nitty-gritty of local state policy making. And it's a fascinating conversation because they start to understand that their entire life is built on a carceral state kind of way of thinking. And then when you start throwing in the white settler state and about whose land you're actually on, who your ancestors killed to be on this land, that's another question entirely. And it sometimes could really shift them. So all I'm trying to say is that we can do this work anywhere. I'll be blunt with you. I think this work is important to be done anywhere, but you got to also understand there's no politics of purity. We got to get rid of that. That's hard. What I mean by that is that we all complicit. Yeah. We're all got some dirt under our fingernails, my cute little fingernails. But no, we get dirt under there. So I think that's really important to kind of play with. But if you don't feel safe, and this is safe, I hate that word safe, but I'm going to say it because this is important too. Maybe this work needs to be done more in the activist space where you feel more flexibility, more ways to grow than in an institution like a predominantly white institution. But I still feel we can do some of that work there as well. That, both of you have already demonstrated that this work is possible, but it isn't without peril. And I think Kay's point is really, really, really well spoken. These institutions, they'll kick you out. You start doing this real radical work, you're putting yourself in a lot of danger. So the work that you're doing, Kay, is also really radical, as is. So,
and I don't think that. If I may, before we move on, I just want to make a comment to what you just said about spaces where we exist, because I know that when I first started teaching 13 years ago, I believe that there were separate spaces, right? So there was a space to do my academic work, there was a space to do my activist work, but there were spaces, and that the spaces were not necessarily connected. That I could be free in my activist space in ways that I couldn't be, say, in my academic space. But because of social media, because the world, in a sense, has gotten very small, there are no spaces. That the same students that sit in my classroom and they're watching me teach and talk about, Hooks or talk about Davis are the same people who follow me on Twitter. And they're like, okay, so she's really radical on Twitter. And then they're popping up in my Instagram feed. Or for me, they're listening to my radio show. And my radio show is an activist space working to tear down white supremacy, not just in the system, but white supremacy in the hearts and minds of people, right? So I know that there are no safe spaces. That's why my evaluations actually include everything. Yeah. It's not just, I didn't like when she taught about bell hooks. I didn't like what she said on the radio the other day, and she said something on Twitter and it really bothered me. Like, they evaluate my life because our students don't see that the spaces are separate.
I agree. I think this idea of a safer space is actually just, throw it out. And what you just said, can I say, is very much like what Joy James meant by shadow boxing and what I ended up playing on. But that is what it is. It's kind of like this poetic way of thinking about how we navigate power, how we duck, how we go forward, move back, duck, hide, but ways where we end up kind of like confronting power in a very interesting way where we practice. It's always a practice, right? So I love that you brought that up, and it's a beautiful way, I think, of demonstrating what she meant.
Okay, since we're there, do you want to say something about like the nuts and bolts of this shadow boxing technique that you?
Well, yeah. I mean, listen, in the classroom, I love this idea of actually creating a lesson plan where there's actually like some movement. And movement can be done, in any which way you want to. It can be done while you're standing, while you're sitting, while you're in a wheelchair, whatever suits you. But this idea of being able to do a lot of deep breathing, a lot of focus, and actually kind of take this Joy James way of thinking about, and again, Joy James was really talking about Black women, radical, militant Black women's way of confronting power. But what you do, and shadow boxers do this when they're practicing for a fight, is that they usually are fighting, you see them fighting alone, but it's interesting. They're fighting somebody in front of them. And that's usually either somebody who's actually out to get you. So that is your known nemesis. But the more powerful definition of it is that you're also fighting yourself. You're seeing your own kind of strengths and weaknesses, and you're trying to dodge, you're trying to kind of like swing with it, move with it in ways that aren't always like frontal. They're not always frontal attacks. So I think what that is, does that make some sense? But doing it in a classroom is interesting because you actually can talk to students about how do you actually deal with certain, when you're navigating an institution that's very difficult to navigate, like the university. How do you survive that, or the prison, or whatever thing that you're dealing with? So I don't want to ramble about it, but I love this idea of you're both fighting, again, a known nemesis of the state, but you're also imagining yourself. And how can you actually duck and dodge those moves in a way that'll keep you preserved, right? Keep you well, and not burning the hell out, and not being totally thrown over and undermined by the powers that are confronting you. So that was, again, James's kind of conceptualization. I've always loved it. Maybe because I'm kind of I love boxing. And in Cuba, I learned how to box when I was living there. So that's another reason.
I want to take this moment to make sure the audience can be part of our conversation. We have only a few minutes. We're a hard stop at 10:50, but is there anybody who wants to slip something into the chat or ask a question? If not, I'm going to turn it back to the panelists, see if anything pops up. One of the questions that did appear about space that I thought was really interesting when you were talking, Shoba, you probably saw Marisol's question or comment about like not just spaces outside of the US, but certain spaces within the US. And that kind of like made me think about this idea that you were talking about like, what is your, somebody typed it out, how have you benefited from the carceral state, right? Well, my neighborhood, and my neighborhood's built in this particular way, but what about, how that operates in neighborhoods that aren't? I think that's the question. Like, what about how are some of the communities attackable that are within the United States, and kind of thinking through that. That's really,
well, I can respond to that.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Another important question that you had asked, Liz, was about white supremacy and unlearning white supremacy, and what Asian students also, how they are also implicated in that whole pattern. I'd like to talk about that because, of course, white supremacy is so deeply entrenched in our society, in the media, at home, and indeed in our classrooms. And Asian American students are as entrenched in these, as steeped in these mythologies as any others. And I would refer to this definitely as a kind of internal colonization, which of course has been brought out by the great anti-colonial theorists, Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral. And which is why I think it's so integral to speak again, to teach again from this, but from a more feminist radical perspective. The text, the canonical text of Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks. Because it's so crucial here, because many Asians and other people of color, we wear these masks too, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. And I try to get my students to confront these masks themselves.
But how? But how? So how do you get them? Would you do that with what you assign, or is there actually like a process in the class? Like, are you intentional in the classroom space and trying to say, okay, we're gonna like this, like kind of along the lines of Lena's question, how have you benefited? Like, is there a praxis you have like that's really direct and calling out, or is it through the materials you assign?
It's through the materials. It's archival and theoretical, but it also gets the students to confront their own, their own internal racisms, internal colonizations. And it's amazing what students can come up with if they're given that opportunity.
I actually have my students to add to that. They do talk back reflections. So we actually engage. I mean, this year, since we haven't been able to be in person, yet we have to be together. So I've had them take their phones and they get questions that they have to ask themselves. What is my race story? Am I a racist? I mean, asking questions. What does white supremacy look like? Am I a white supremacist? It's like, I'm like, you take that camera into your bedroom, ask yourself, because we got 90 seconds, and then we actually put those online. Like, I'm the founding director of the Carson Institute for Race, Peace, and Social Justice. We put their talkbacks online, and then we engage with them. So it's actually a process that we go through. Because I'm doing something, I just want to say very quickly that I mentioned in the book. I said that we were creating and conceptualizing Meridians as a liberated, non-sexist, non-misogynistic, anti-racist, anti-classist tool that without space or boundaries or borders that can be used everywhere. And we do use this everywhere. And someone asked about the Harvard implicit bias survey. I don't do that because I've tried that in my classroom and it just becomes an exercise because I have some issues with Harvard anyway and the treatment of what they do with art and tools and Black bodies and bones. So I don't put them on a pedestal. Instead, we do implicit bias testing that I designed for the students that are in front of me.
Yeah, I mean, last night when Ruth Simmons was giving the keynote and talking about Toni Morrison I couldn't help but think about Cornel West not getting tenure at Harvard. And it's like, how can I even, who cares what you say? No offense, people from Harvard, but welcome.
I'm at Johns Hopkins University. It's another lovely institution, where you're like, where are the bodies buried? Really, they're all underneath the ground. They still don't want to recover the bodies and give them a proper burial. I just say one last question is I also think what's really nice about a lot of the work I've looked at is there's an interesting push against a politics of respectability and of recognition. And I just want to say that a lot of these Indigenous and Black radical feminists have got us thinking about maybe it's more important for us to also have conversations now with each other. A lot of the times there's this call in the media, for example, for Indigenous women who have been victimized by brutality, state violence, sexual violence, to always come up and parade their trauma in front of a white audience, for a white audience. And it's interesting that a lot of them are now saying, we're tired of this shit. We don't want to perform anymore. We want to refuse the performance. And we want to talk to each other more. We want to talk to other Indigenous women and girls and trans folks to heal. We don't want to always perform and take our energy and spend our energy, our precious energy, to always talk to the white media. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point, but I want to also say that sometimes maybe the work, I know Kay's got an important point, but sometimes maybe we can reserve also some more time for our own communities. And I think both of you are doing it. I'm not saying you're not. I'm just highlighting that the work you've done is also a key point that many of these activist scholars have already made. Mm-hmm. Let's do something different.
I'm sorry, everyone, but we have 1 minute left and I have to close us out because we do have the hard stop of 10:50. This has been such an engaging, tremendous conversation. I can't thank you all enough for the pieces that I will take to my own classroom that you gave me. Thank you so much for your beautiful essays and the beautiful work in this opening discussions for the Meridians panel. I want to tell people to hang out for 10 minutes for the 11 o'clock panel, whose speech acts violence at home and abroad, that will be coming up at 11 o'clock. And just thank you all. Really beautiful, beautiful job. Thank you so much.
Thank you for facilitating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you later.